Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'd first just like to begin by thanking Sean for sending us the invite to come back here. It's something I know I always wanted to come back here. Jackie and I spoke about it so many times, but it just never happened. And I think the invite just came at the right moment. And we said, yes, let's do it. So we're here, and it's been really wonderful. So I'd really, really like to thank you, and I know there's a lot of people behind you who've been involved in that as well. Sure, that introduction this morning was incredibly moving, and it's sort of really put, I think, what I want to say today in sort of such a different light. Sure. The day that Mandela was released, I live in Cape Town. We knew it was coming. We didn't know when. And the weekend it happened, myself and a group of friends, we had gone away for the weekend. I went on one condition, though, that if Mandela was released, they all agreed that we would pack up and drive back to Cape Town immediately. So yeah, we were, I think we were out camping or something. You know, those days you didn't have cell phones and internet. I think we were running to the car, turning the radio on every couple of hours. And on the Sunday morning of the 2nd of February, the news came, Mandela's being released. My friends had given me an undertaking we would drive back to Cape Town immediately. And very quickly, we packed the car. We were in a rush to get back. We were so excited. And the police and the traffic police were out in full force that day. And as we got closer to Cape Town, we were speeding. And we got pulled over by the traffic police. And in those days, they were these very large, tall, white Afrikaners, men who were rather gruff. They weren't really nice people. They pulled us over. They wrote us the ticket. We were these poor students who really didn't want the ticket. I was feeling particularly bad. I think I was making the driver drive too fast. And as he had finished writing the ticket to us, he said, I would advise you not to go, if you're heading back to Cape Town, do not go anywhere near the city centre. And of course we already had the ticket, so it was fine. He couldn't increase it. We said, why? He says, no, Mandela's been released. The crowds, they're descending. And we looked at him and we went, that's exactly where we're going. And I think one could literally see the blood drain out of his face. He was not excited with what was happening that day. But then sort of very quickly dropping our stuff off, and then I never forget driving through to the city centre, and for the very first time seeing we have in South Africa what we call black taxis, minibus taxis. Okay, they're these like sort of vehicles that should take between 12 and 14, but usually take a lot more people in them. And these vehicles were literally packed, and people chanting, and people singing. I'm sort of almost getting emotional now, like Roger did, just thinking back on it. And the ANC flag, for the first time, it was banned. We were not allowed to see it. And people had the flags out of their windows, okay? And the taxis, they were like singing, you know? And getting to the square where Mandela was to be released, and sitting there, and more people arriving. And everyone was so happy, everyone was so orderly. we had been told, when Mandela's released, there will be violence. There was no violence that day. It didn't matter who you were. We were all South Africans. And I can remember the trains coming into Cape Town station. They were packed full. I'm sure they must have laid on additional trains that day. And as the people from the townships from outside of Cape Town came in, they got off the train, and it's sort of quite a sort of almost like straight path from the train and along the roads, okay, to the square. And the people lined up, sort of 10 to like 12 abreast, and just like, it was like a sea of them, okay, singing and chanting, and more people coming onto the square. It was just a really, really incredible day, such an incredible day to have been there and knowing that you were part of history. And yeah, I was a young law student at that time, and here I am, today, and I was just thinking, there's that quote from Nelson Mandela, which I'm sure everyone knows, and it says, "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." And standing here today, I just think, I'm not an academic like Heinz. I have in South Africa, I suppose, being on the ground, on the cutting edge, very practical experience of what those many, many hills are. I think so many people possibly thought that putting an X on a ballot paper would lead to a magic wand. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the South African Human Rights Commission. I'm hoping I'll find some time to give some examples, because I also feel I just need to explain to you exactly what the Commission is a bit so that you can understand. But certainly I will give you an indication and a flavor as to what it is really like to work at an institution such as this. So in our Constitution, the preamble states in these very beautiful words that it was adopted to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, improve the quality of life of all citizens, and build a united and democratic South Africa. And that is an ideal which I think we're still striving for in South Africa. Many more hills still to climb. And so I think Heinz has set out for us quite clearly about the Chapter 9s that are set out in the Constitution. So I've been with the South African Human Rights South African Human Rights Commission, or maybe I should say I've survived the Commission for 15 years. I'm certainly the most senior, longest serving person there. I don't know how I have survived the place, but I have. South Africa workplaces and spaces are not very easy spaces to work in. I sometimes think they are possibly one of the most complex workspaces to be in, particularly when you're in a senior position to manage. Diversity is so good, but diversity in South Africa with our past and our troubled past and where people come from, people can't leave that at the door when they come into the workspace. And that comes into the workspace. And one finds, and even when you speak to people who work across the board, particularly in government, that very often the workspaces can be quite dysfunctional. They can even be toxic at times, and they can be very, very difficult places to work. And I think one sort of needs to understand that when one is looking at an institution and what it has achieved or what it hasn't achieved, as to how difficult these places can actually just be personally to work in. And I'll mention now before I go into the Commission, as well as also with the new democratic dispensation in terms of running organizations and being accountable and ensuring that they're not things such as fraud, misuse of funds. We have this incredible legislation called the Public Finance Management Act. And I fully support this piece of legislation, but it's something I speak out about a lot in the Commission, because I sometimes think it makes the institution so institutionalized, it dumbs out creativity. And I once did a calculation a few years ago that for every person in the Commission who, in my view, was a human rights worker, there were 3 non-human rights workers. Okay? So you just land up being this massive institution, and particularly when you get into senior management, you're spending about 90% of your time just managing, and so that those doors can open every day, okay? So that people can come to you. And in terms of how the budget is split, everything is just so that you can have these officers, okay, and that you can have people there and that you can comply with the PFMA. There's such little time and money is actually left to do the work for why you are there. So those are just 2 broad comments to start. But let me just go into what the mandate of the South African Human Rights Commission is. It's set out in section 184.1 of the Constitution, and it's to promote respect for human rights and a culture of human rights, which I think makes it very different from the public protector who receives complaints. We also receive complaints, but we've got this broad, at times one thinks it's almost a slightly romantic notion that we're going to build this human rights culture. I mean, what is that? How do you do it? How tangible is it? And how do you measure whether we are succeeding in that? Also in that section, it says that we're there to promote the protection, the development, and the attainment of human rights. And note, this is not the rights of the child, this is not environmental rights, this is not housing, this is not prisoners' rights, this is the whole panoply, is that the word, of rights. It's everything, okay? So it's incredibly difficult when your mandate is so broad to work out where exactly it is that you should focus. And everyone thinks that you should be focusing on something else, and that something else is more important. So there's that complete tension the whole time. And then 184C says to monitor and assess the observance of human rights in the Republic. Again, I think all of us know monitoring human rights is something which we still haven't got right, in terms of how to monitor human rights and whether you're being successful. It's like, hallelujah, the day that somebody can say this is how you do it, okay? So very difficult for the Commission, again, when people say, oh, you're not monitoring, well, how do we prove to you that we're doing this, okay? And then in the Constitution, it also says that in terms of our powers, we can investigate and report. We can take steps to secure appropriate redress, which I think is going to be interesting, following the Constitutional Court ruling, carry out research and to educate, and then a fascinating clause. And this goes to issues around inequality and poverty in South Africa, and the fact that in our Constitution it really stood out because it embodies your economic and social rights. And because of this, in the Constitution, there's a clause which says each year the Human Rights Commission must require relevant organs of state to provide the Commission with information on the measures that they have taken towards the realization of the rights in the Bill of Rights concerning housing, health care, food, water, social security, education, and the environment. So a very specific mandate that we must require organs of state to provide us with information. Okay. Along the years, we've also picked up a few additional responsibilities outside of the Constitution. And one needs to note that never once, with our scope of the Commission being made broader, has the money ever followed that broadening, despite it being promised. So we have the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which bestows an incredible amount of responsibilities on the Commission. Okay. At one stage, I recall, in terms of that act, everyone had to lodge a report with the Commission. Okay, and I was in charge of the office down in Cape Town at that point, and the deadline came. Everyone was frantic. And on the day that those reports were supposed to be handed in by public bodies, the phones of the Human Rights Commission throughout the country were jammed, and our entire computer system crashed. And a couple of years later, they worked out that had all those reports arrived, that we would have had to have got, I think, an additional building, okay, to save the hard copies. So thankfully, they just keep extending that date, okay. But this just gives you an indication of how our mandate gets expanded, but the money doesn't come. There's also then a fantastic piece of legislation called the Equality Act, which is the Promotion of Equality and the Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. This sets up a system of equality courts where if you've been discriminated, they are set up in a way, and the idea is that they are accessible to everyone, that you do not need an attorney, that you can go there and represent yourself, and it's supposed to be a quick and an effective way to secure redress. So the Commission has also then got a whole lot of duties in terms of that act, and once again, the money hasn't come. The promotional aspects of that act to this day are yet to be put into force, okay? Yet we're currently having a conversation in South Africa around racism and how we should be doing so much more. And everyone forgets that since 2000, we've had this brilliant piece of legislation which provides for all the promotional aspects, okay, that would counter racism, okay, but it just hasn't ever been implemented. And then, of course, there's the South African Human Rights Commission Act, which also just sets out in more detail how it is that we operate. So our commission was inaugurated in October 2015, and recently we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. In terms of being at the commission, I have worked very closely, in fact always having a direct link in terms of reporting to the chairperson. I started under Barney Tatiana, who was a stalwart in the struggle against apartheid. I then worked with Jodie Collopin, who is now a judge on the High Court. I foresee him maybe joining you one day, Justice. Strong possibility there, I always think. He would write beautiful judgments. And now Advocate Lawrence Mshwana, the former public protector, who possibly, I think, in his role as chair of the Human Rights Commission, it possibly suits him better. And yeah, that would be an interesting comparison to make, Heinz. So we have commissioners. This is how it works. Unlike the public protector, where you have one person in charge, yeah, we have commissioners, okay? And they are appointed for a period of 7 years. They need to be broadly representative in terms of race, gender, and disability. They're supposed to come from a broad sort of number of backgrounds. So currently amongst our commissioner, we've got people with human rights experience, academia, trade union, former members of parliament. We've got it there. And I think that you can also imagine that when you take a number of very eminent people, who are usually A-type personalities, and you put them together, you're setting yourself up for a very interesting mix. And very often when new commissioners come in, it takes quite some time for them to work each other out and settle down and to be able to actually work together. I sometimes think that the human rights commissions with so many members are inherently set up in order that there will be tensions there amongst the commissioners, which could be used in a positive or negative way, depending who those people are. In terms of the commission currently as well, the commissioners, because our mandate is so broad, they divide themselves in terms of focus areas, geographic areas, and then the various treaty bodies. So some of the focus areas at the moment, for example, are children's rights and basic education, disability and older persons, human rights and law enforcement, and prevention of torture, and lastly, migration and equality. So already people will be going, well, why haven't you got this and why haven't you got that? The Commission, similar to the Public Protector, but we don't have as large a budget, has got offices in all 9 provinces. The staff currently sits at some 150, which again is less than the Public Protector. The budget currently sits around 130 million rands, again less than the Public Protector receives, which is also interesting. It's very interesting that a society founded on trying to build a human rights culture, that so little money is invested into the most important body which should be doing that, and maybe says something about how strong the commitment is to ensuring that we have this human rights culture. So we got our commissioners at the top, and they are there for the strategic direction of the commission, and then beneath it you have the secretariat with your 150 members, and that's where I've slotted in for the last 15 years. It's then divided up into different departments. So you've got your legal services department, where similar to the Public Protector, we also receive cases and we process these complaints. If I'm correct with recent figures, it's around 8,000 or so complaints a year which the Commission receives. Very interesting, and I thought talking about Gogo Dlamini was very interesting. At the Commission, the very individual cases we get from people who walk into our offices off the street or phone, your real Gogo Dlaminis out there. In those cases where they get resolved and recommendations are made, there's an almost 100% success rate. And I think it shows that the kind of legitimacy that the Commission does have out there with your average citizens. It has been very seldom and very rare where a party to a complaint has just said, no, we won't do that, or we won't apologize, or anything like that. So there certainly is a high success rate at that level in terms of cases. I mean, very often if a matter comes into the Commission, simply by making a phone call, one can resolve it, because no individual and no person wants the South African Human Rights Commission breathing down their necks. I recall, I mean, I've never really been involved in complaints, but I got dragged into this one once where a Jewish man came into our offices, and on the Jewish traditional Friday night, after they had finished eating dinner, it was a large family gathering, as they were saying goodbye to their guests, their neighbors, who clearly had been drinking a bit, started shouting, burn, burn, go to the gas chambers, and other very harsh anti-Semitic comments being made at them. And this man was just sobbing. It was very, very emotional, and he came and what can we do about it? And we assisted them in the initial phases to take that case to the Equality Court. And in the end, the outcome was that those neighbors had to issue a public apology in the local Jewish newspaper, formal apology to these people. They also had to give a certain sum of money, I can't remember what it was, to the benefit of some organization. But almost immediately after that case, the perpetrators sold up their house and they moved. So it gives you an indication as to what can happen, and it's not just outside the recommendation of the Commission, but the impact it can have on people if you are taken to the Human Rights Commission. I can assure you no one wants to be taken to the Human Rights Commission in South Africa. We then have our Research and Documentation Centre, who are responsible primarily for the Economic and Social Rights Report, that one I referred to earlier. I mean, the mandate comes directly from Section 184.3 of the... getting it wrong. The next one in the Constitution. I think the Commission has really struggled. I don't think the Commission has got it quite right. It certainly requests government to send information to it each year. Whether that information arrives is a different matter. Whether that information is accurate is a different matter. Whether the Commission itself has got it completely correct as to how to ask for that information could also be another matter. So the Commission's been doing it. I would say work in progress still at this stage in terms of moving that report forward. I don't know how many people actually read those reports. I'm embarrassed. Then there is the Advocacy and Communications Unit, which does all your outreach. That's sort of straightforward. And then also there's Parliamentary and International Affairs, and that's where I slotted in for many years until about 3 or 4 years ago, where the work there really was in terms of legislation going through Parliament, scanning it, scrutinising it, drafting submissions, going off to Parliament, going to the committees, working with committees. There were public hearings, going there, preparing what it is, what the Commission would say. And let me perhaps just give you 2 anecdotes, because if I just stick to the dry stuff, it's going to be very, very boring. And again, I'm coming back to gogos, which is grandmothers. We had an older person's legislation being processed in South Africa a few years ago. And at that stage, we had Commissioner Tom Mantata. Those from South Africa will know him. And he was in charge of older persons. So Commissioner Tom and I decided we were going to go to every single province in the country, and we were going to go there. We were going to workshop the draft legislation, and we would find out what people on the ground. We wanted to speak directly with the Gogos on the ground throughout the country. And this is basically what we did over a period of about a year or so. There was Tom Mantata, very elderly at the time, sort of climbing onto little aeroplanes to fly to the Northern Cape. And, you know, he really is one of the struggle stalwarts. Everywhere you go with him, he's a celebrity or a rock star. And so it's wonderful to go directly with him. But we really went around, and I suppose you can't just give people a piece of legislation, particularly when one thinks about the older generation. Many had not received much education during apartheid. So it was more, in a sense, taking that legislation and explaining in very much plain language what it is, and then listening to them as to whether they thought that this legislation would speak to their needs. And one of the things which we as a commission realized increasingly, and this is a phenomena which I don't think has been particularly researched or looked at in South Africa, but it's how, when all the legislation needed to be changed after the end of apartheid, where the racism was removed from all the legislation, is to what extent was the racism structural, okay, and to what extent, when one merely removed references to black, white, coloured, Indian, did one still continue to perpetuate racism? And I think the Older Persons Act is a very good example of this. Many people didn't even know in South Africa that the white Afrikaans speaking, not even speaking about English speaking, white Afrikaans speaking South Africa have one of the highest rates in the world of sending their elderly to old age homes. It's strange, but it's true. Whereas we know that within the African culture, you look after your own. You have enormous respect for the elderly, and you look up to them. So yeah, we had this new piece of legislation, okay, trying to bring in a bit of the constitution, get rid of the racism, but basically it was just setting up old age homes, okay, for black people, which goes completely counter. And I think that was one of the biggest things for us to point out to Parliament, that what they were doing was just merely entrenching institutionalized racism, and that what they were seeking to provide would not actually speak to the reality and the needs of older persons on the ground, okay? And we even had some, we managed to line up, I think, about 15 NGOs. We had coordinated behind the scenes that each one would be speaking to a different issues, so we covered all our issues over 2 days of public hearings. We even had a couple of Gogos come in, you know, from the townships, speaking about, for example, what it was like to be a grandmother in the new South Africa, okay, and all the hope that had brought, and then to witness your children dying of HIV and AIDS. Something we didn't really think about in 1994. It was around, but, you know, but by then the scourge was there, you know, and so many sort of people who had young children basically were being wiped out by AIDS. And yeah, instead of being elderly and being allowed to relax, they were now having to be parents again, and how they were battling, not because in terms of finance, how they were not being supported by government, but the intergenerational issues, and the real pain of having to eke out an existence on a, you know, on a older person's, you know, state pension grant, but you may be also looking after 5, 6, 7 children at the same time. And one of the most incredible things after those public hearings, which were very intense, the chairperson of the portfolio committee, he looked at our Department of Social Development and said, "You have sat here for 2 days. You have listened to what all these people have said, and we agree with them. this legislation is just not good enough. Take it back, go work on it again, and come back to us when it is fixed. And it eventually landed up, I can remember when the legislation finally came back, I was like sitting next to the state law advisor, and you just go, that should change, that's not right, and it really made an incredible impact in terms of that legislation to ensure that we've got the framework at least, okay, implementation is always something else, but the framework at least for older persons, that we've got it correct in terms of their protection, their care, the sort of approach towards aging as something which is progressive legislation which values older persons in aging. There's then also the other area of work that I've worked in is your international affairs, where really getting the Commission to grapple with, and I spoke about this a lot yesterday, but to grapple with what does it mean to be a Human Rights Commission in terms of your international human rights law obligations. And I think, it goes to what we spoke about yesterday of South Africa not only being a Human Rights Commission, but being a national human rights not only being a Human Rights Commission, but a national human rights institution at the international level, and how there's been increasing recognition over the last 10 years of NHRIs, and that there are now permanent players and features at the international level, and the enormous responsibility that bestows on the Commission. I always look at it as another way, in another light as well, and really why I really try to push for international work to be taken more seriously in the Commission, is that being active at an international level is also like an insurance, because if you are highly regarded and respected at an international level, it would be a lot more difficult should you come under threat for government to be able to do that. And therefore it's very important that at an international level you are complying, that you're putting pressure on government to submit treaty body reports in order that the government is accountable, not just at the domestic level, but at the international level as well. I'm going to finish up. So, has the Commission been successful over the past 20 years? I would just say it's a work in progress. Could we have done better? Yes, we could have. We've looked at a myriad of issues. We've had many public hearings, which again are an accountability mechanism. Through public hearings, that is where you bring government together, because we have this convening power. If we ask government to come, they must come. We put them in the same room together with NGOs, and it's usually the first time they've all been together in one room, and they actually have to talk and they actually have to listen to each other. But it's also public, and therefore government has to answer questions. And so the reports which come out of public inquiries, be they on sexual offences, human rights in farming communities, Kamani San, education, healthcare, evictions, water and sanitation, the information is out there. As to whether government takes our recommendations seriously, I don't know. I attended just recently the 20th celebrations of the Commission, and there was talk and hopefully some consensus at that meeting that what the Commission needs to do is take all of its recommendations from the past 20 years and to see what extent they could see where government has taken on the recommendations which the Commission has in fact made. I'm running out of time, so let me just carry on, because I'd rather get some questions. Just that. I think, though, to sum up, and what we could say is that, yes, the Commission could have achieved a lot more, but at the same time, it has also achieved a lot. I think now, for the Commission, now more than ever before, both in terms of what is going on at a domestic level, but also what is going on at an international level, that the work of a Human Rights Commission is now more important than what it was ever before, in order to truly build that human rights culture, that we need in South Africa. And perhaps just to end off with one of my favorite quotes, which I really like, and it comes from Viktor Frankl, a Nazi Holocaust survivor. He has a beautiful quote which always says, "What is to give life must endure burning." And I think in terms of our human rights culture in South Africa and getting there, it's still burning, okay, for that life in the true sense to come. Thank you, but I'll open up for questions.
This is so enriching, but I feel a little bit like a voyeur. What do I mean by that? We're getting glimpses of conversations that you're all a part of. I can see the furious nodding and writing down of comments and looking back at each other, and it's just exciting to look in on these conversations that are so meaningful and relevant to what's happening in South Africa right now. But you've also made it relevant to those of us who are more students of the South African context. Any questions? Again, we have a follow-up panel. Is there a question maybe from the floor? Yes, please, Rahina.
Hi.
So I am very interested in this almost 100% implementation of the recommendations in the individual level. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, what would you say is the reason for this success of the implementation of the recommendations?
When we speak about the complaints of individual citizens who come in, I think that goes to a very interesting debate about how is it that the Human Rights Commission, where does its power come from? And I think the Justice was also speaking about that yesterday. It comes through legitimacy, it comes through accountability, and it is in that manner which there is respect for the institution. I also think in South Africa, people are acutely aware of their human rights, and given our background, it's just nobody wants to feel that or have someone say to them, like, you're violating someone else's human rights, and you certainly don't want to go to the Human Rights Commission. Businesses or individuals, they would rather get rid of those complaints. The majority of our complaints, I didn't mention, are complaints of racism. And recently in South Africa, we've had this sort of big story going on around Penny Sparrow, who over the December holidays called black people monkeys when they went to the beach, and it's ignited this whole talk around racism. But from working at the Commission, I can tell you every single holiday period we get a lot of these cases, some of them far worse than the Penny Sparrow case. I think it was maybe politically expedient for Penny Sparrow to put that utterance onto, I think it was Facebook or Twitter. But I mean, and we have many other cases. I mean, one sort of in a similar vein to that is an employer who asked a black employee for their ID. Okay, took the ID, made a copy of it, but then managed somehow to remove the person's face and put a picture of a baboon, okay, and then handed the photocopy back to the employee and said, "No, that's better, that's how you look," okay. So, I mean, yeah, one could speak about these cases, but I mean, those are the majority of our cases. And what you find and what's so interesting in these cases is that the victims very often, all they want is an acknowledgement and an apology. There's something incredibly deep and raw about racism, you know, and it's people want something really genuine, like an apology. So very often, this is why with the commission, they prefer to use their powers to actually bring the parties together and to have conciliation or to have mediation. And it's part of building the human rights culture as well. You don't want to just say to, you know, the racist, you know, slap them on the wrist and say you've been naughty and don't do that again. You also want that person to become part of the South Africa that we're trying to create, and try and do it in a way that will include them and assist in building this human rights culture. Thanks.
Thank you.